Hi, welcome to the first lecture video for The Path of War, Part 3. This is for assignment number 2. And so you should be looking at this Nearpod, either in the self-paced or maybe you're looking at the slides. But this is for our week 32, part 3 of The Path to War. And we're going to be switching and talking more about the war in the Pacific. And that war was definitely more on the Asian continents and involved mostly just Japan. And so what we're going to be talking about is the essential questions of what was Japan like during the early 20th century and including the two world wars. And we're going to be kind of flashing back a little bit to what we actually know about Japan and discussing some of those ideas. And then during this time, who led Japan and how did they lead? And this is actually a very important notion because we assume that there were only a few types of governments. Well, the Japanese were able to actually also create a type of almost a constitutional monarchy. So we'll discuss that. And how did other countries react to Japan's growth as a world power? And this is actually something very important because Japan became something well known in the world stage. Whereas this kind of also led to disputes. One of the biggest ones happened in Nanjing. And this is actually a very important incident. And we will be discussing this more actually in the second video. So if you look at lecture video number 2, that's where we're going to be talking more about the comments and the document sources for what happened to Nanjing. All right, folks, let's go ahead and talk about what you know about Japan. So anything you know about Japan, whether it's anime or Sony or like PlayStation, any of those things, and also the history is actually very important because the history of Japan, which is actually very rooted in tradition, is also something that we still see very evident in the landscape and in the government and in also the culture of Japan. So go ahead and stop the video right now and think about, or even want to Google a couple things that you know about Japan. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and move on from what we know about Japan, and I'm going to tell you what I know about Japan. And there's quite a few things, okay? But before we talk about that, what were the major industrial nations outside of Europe in 1939? Were there major ones outside of Europe? Meaning that were there a lot more industrialized countries prior to 1939 outside of Europe itself? And that could be a true or a false question. So go ahead and pause the video for a sec and go ahead and choose. All right, of course, from that question of the true or false, it is very false. There were actually very many countries outside of Europe that were industrialized by late 1939, and what we were looking at is one of the very unusual cases. And outside of Europe, you had USA. Okay, which was starting to heavily industrialize since the 1800s, and whereas Japan kind of follows suit afterwards. And there was a lot of reasons for this. Japan was helped by the Dutch in the very early 1600s, whereas the Dutch brought writing, science, and all sorts of different things to Japan, which actually people took seriously. And by the late 1800s, after I guess the open door policy happened in most of Asia for many Asian countries. Different countries, such as USA mainly, came and really kind of influenced Japan. And by the time of the late 1800s, around 1880s to the 1890s, Japan was already in the mindset of industrializing, but not changing who they were. And this is actually something very unique about Japan. They were the only ones that really kind of believed in that. So during this time, you have to understand something about how Japan government worked. So the Japanese government was separated in many occasions and many dynasties between a military leader and a spiritual leader. And the spiritual leader was pretty much the emperor. Whereas the military leader, sometimes known as the shogun, was really the power behind everything. But yet they still defer a little bit to the emperor. The emperor was more somebody that the people would look to as almost like a deity, almost like someone that was revered. And so during this time of 1939, okay, and finally we get to actually our notes here. Hidaka Tojo was actually put in charge as this military leader, and him and his generals were one of the prime forces in World War II during the time of Japan. Attacked Pearl Harbor and attacked America. So Tojo, okay, wanted to expand Japan. He wanted to further industrialize because at that time they were already industrialized, very modern armies, they even imperialized some nations and countries such as Korea, and of course a lot of the neighboring islands. And so by this time, they were looking to expand into China. And so Tojo was prime minister of Japan, and he was actually leading in accord to what the emperor, in theory, was doing. But in sense, he was pretty much a dictator. And so Japan's traditions, I mean, were really something that they held dearly to. And so the emperor and military leaders, this kind of dichotomy of like ruling, really it was actually the military leaders that were actually ruling. And this is actually something that carried over from the shogun periods or the time of the samurai. And so, if you're interested in kind of stuff like that, go watch the Last Samurai. It's not entirely accurate, but it does actually talk about how Japan started industrializing in the 1800s. So Emperor Hirohito was actually the emperor during this time. He was a young guy. He was he really actually believed in the spirit of Japan and wanted Japan to be this the sense of the center. And so in that sense there was a lot of deference and the idea of not a lot of nationalism of like how Japan was, so very similar to what fascism was in Germany. And so the people worshiped the emperor. There was actually a very public image of the Japanese leadership, and so this again led to again really extreme nationalists because Japan really believed they were kind of the land of the rising sun. Okay, and it would kind of started here in Japan, and it should end somewhere else, right? So the extreme nationalism was this idea of like a Japanese spirit, and I guess even you can say in the military spirit, it would be the samurai spirit, the need for battle, and the need for expansion, and even actually conquering. So this actually very again is very similar to the idea of Liebestraum. Okay, what Hitler was talking about of space, of living space, and Japan was an island, so I mean there was only a limited amount of space they can go, and this is actually where they started kind of taking off and expanding to other areas like Korea and of course Manchuria, and we'll talk about that later. And this actually leads to the Sino-Japanese War. Manchuria was actually, if you know anything about Manchuria, it is actually part of China, but China during those times, I mean, even before and even in ancient times, there was actually different subgroups and nations in China itself. Okay, there was the Mongols, there was actually the Hans and the Manchurians, and these were all different subgroups. And so the invasion of Manchuria for Japan was actually taking one of the subgroups down in China, in sense. And that got even more severe when Japan actually started moving south towards the capital of that time in China, which was Nanjing. And this is actually going to lead to something very, very awful and the controversial event of Nanjing, um, which people debate today as some of the worst war crimes ever committed. And so we'll talk about that as we get to the second video. Okay. All right, guys. So what are some reasons? Okay. So think about what reasons Japan might to support the decision to invade a neighbor. Okay. Think about geography. Think about, I guess, Japanese spirit. Think about culture. Think about all of the different things. Why like a nation like Japan decide to support or invade their neighbors? And by the early 1900s, Japan was very fully invested in Western ideas. As America was invested in those ideas. And so think about even those possible venues of why Japan would invade, Korea or invade Manchuria or like the Philippines and the smaller islands. Go ahead and stop the video now and go ahead and answer. All right, so again, there was actually two leaders of Japan. Emperor Hirohito was more like the spiritual leader. You can see he was actually a very young man. He wasn't actually too old during that time, but he actually stays emperor until 1989. All right, so that's actually all the way into the future. So we could see that the dynasty or the emperor of Japan doesn't necessarily ever they never actually do away with this idea of an emperor, even though they don't really actually have a monarchy. Okay, so Hidaki Tojo is actually the person that was really in charge because he was in charge of the military, and the expansions of to different islands to where they were going was actually more or less directed by this man. All right, so let's talk about Hirohito. Okay, so Hirohito has a long life. Again, I mentioned that he lived from the early 1919s to all the way to 1989, probably longer than that. But in this video, take notes about the Emperor of Japan, and then think about his experiences and why would he want war with other countries. Okay, I'm gonna allow you to play the video on your own Nearpod, and even if you want to look this up in the YouTube, you can. So I'm gonna skip this section, but make sure you watch the video and understand what is going on. It's only about 3 minute video. It's fairly short, but I could go ahead and skip this. All right, so what experiences did Emperor Hirohito have that might make him want to go to war with other countries? And so think about what was mentioned. Think about I guess those people that were around him and what the general idea of how Hirohito should be handling some diplomacy, and also what kind of goals did he set for Japan? Okay, go ahead and stop the video right now, and you could go ahead and continue with this thought. What might have Hirohito think about going to war? All right, and so the next part we're going to be looking at propaganda. And so our propaganda pieces and political cartoons always reliable historical sources, and why or why not. So explain your answer. So propaganda is something that we talk about to kind of show a very specific event of something that's happening during that time. But are they always reliable historical sources, or are they sometimes um, kind of skewed in some way, and why? So think about this. Okay, we're going to be looking at some propaganda pieces. Go ahead and stop the video, answer your question, and then when you start, we're going to go and discuss more propaganda. All right, so we're going to be doing a compare and contrast. So on the left, you have a picture of a butterfly. It's a butterfly, and it looks like pretty nice. It has like nice like wings. And on the right, you see actually a picture of a wasp. And so these two political cartoons are very similar. They're actually supposed to be supporting each other, or actually they're actually the same thing. So you see, it's the emergence of Japan, and it's actually suggesting the same thing. But why are they kind of different views? So look at them carefully, and why? Who would it be? Who would you actually consider to kind of view the one on the left? Who will be viewing the one on the left about Japan as the butterfly? And then on the right, who do you think will be viewing Japan as a wasp? And so you go ahead and answer that over here. And so go ahead and answer this question as we come to some different aspects of this. Okay, so there is actually a little bit of a quiz here. You select the one you want. And so let's go ahead and do that quiz first, okay? I'm not going to do it, but I hope that you take the time to complete this, and so you understand a little bit more about what is going on with this idea of propaganda. All right, folks, we're going to move on. And going to answer this question about what perspective, what country does the political cartoon illustrate? And this is actually the one about the wasp. Okay, so who do you think is, looking at this? Because even though the words are the same, the picture is not, and that changes the context, doesn't it? So who is probably viewing this idea of Japan as a wasp? Going to stop the video now. Complete your work. And so when we talk about Japan, what type of government was Japan? Japan in the Meiji era began to explore using the emperor's power in a way to kind of unify the people, but having actually a very modern and even Western type of government. And they even had a Western constitution. And so that happened almost at the end of the 1890s, where the Meiji emperor kind of took over all of Japan, and they really started adopting Western ways, especially even in the government. And so they had a legislature, the parliament, they had a constitution, they even had, I guess, in a sense, a leader in many ways that was more like a government or a prime minister. Okay, so they had a prime minister. So that actually all happened early on, close to the turn of the century. And so we could see actually what happened in this timeline. So Japan's government becomes democratic. They have a parliament. They kind of get involved in international treaties and even to agreeing on China's borders. I mean, we also know in actually in 1918, Japan gets a piece, a chunk of China because, well, it was actually involved in World War One, and it helped actually defeat Germany by taking over some of Germany's like territories. So when China didn't receive their territory back, and instead Japan had received it, there was a huge uproar in China. But it was mainly because the Western powers saw Japan more as equal and an ally than China, of course. And so that really kind of hurt this whole situation with China. All right, so Japan signs the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact, renouncing war. So remember, also Japan was also part of the League of Nations at this point. And then, as we kind of noticed, Japan has some sort of like weaknesses in their like lawmaking body, and then it goes into a long economic depression, uh, mainly because probably because how connected uh, Japan's economy is with the rest of the world and with the U.S. So because of the depression, a lot of people actually try to like support the military over the civilian government. So the military becomes more definitely a lot stronger because of depression, the Great Depression. And so the military leadership makes the emperor the symbol of the state, but really the military is the government. The military are the ones that are taking charge, kind of directing things, and in a way influence the people to kind of take this idea of, I guess, expansion and taking resources seriously. And by close to the early like 1930s, even into late 1930s, they planned a whole idea of like a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, so that they could solve some of the economic problems that they're seeing. And so bring all these Asian nations into kind of into a trading pact or into an idea where they should be kind of working together and even actually expanding their foreign influence, or even expanding their foreign territories. This is actually where Japan is thinking about by the turn of like the close to the end to where World War II is going to start. In 1931, Japan seizes Manchuria, okay, and establishes a puppet government, which pretty much Manchuria just kind of defers to Japan. They can't really do anything unless Japan says so. Very much like how Hong Kong is at this moment with like China, and pretty much China is actually the government. Hong Kong actually had like for many years an independent government from Japan, from China, but that's not the case anymore. So that's actually kind of a very, very similar comparison, but not exactly true because they're not separate countries, technically. All right, so what is a puppet government? Okay, so Napoleon did it. I think China does it now. And so during the time of imperialism, a lot of nations did it then. And Japan was doing this to Korea and probably also Manchuria during the early, like a turn of the centuries, the early 1920s and 1930s. So what does that actually mean? What is that? What is that puppet government? And just kind of like answer it the way you think it would be fit. All right, guys, go ahead and pause the video so you can take some time to answer this. All right, so further on, this democratic reform to military aggression. So before they were actually voting. And then Japan, because the League of Nations was like, hey, we don't like you like taking over Manchuria, they leave. They leave the like League of Nations because there's no one actually kind of policing anyone in the League of Nations. So in 1930, Japan leaves and withdraws from the League of Nations, just like Germany. And November 1936, Japan, Germany, and Italy decide to ally. Hey, we all left the League of Nations. Why don't we become friends? And they say, yeah. And so everybody that kind of left the League of Nations starts their own little like gang, and it becomes one of the most powerful military forces to kind of rival kind of world domination during that time. And so Japan then fully invests in a full-on invasion of China during this time where there was great civil war and the Republic of China at that time is not doing too well because of the Great Depression as well. And so they kind of invade and everything goes topsy-turvy. All right, so we can see that here is the Japanese Empire, okay? And this is actually their expansion into different territories. So they acquired Korea very early on in 1932. And sorry, they actually got Korea in the 1920s, and then that expanded into Manchuria into the 1932 and on, and so they go in further into the south, and this is actually where they kind of expand into more territories, and they start fighting communists. Mao Zedong at that time is still kind of waging his campaign, and he actually does fairly well against the Japanese, whereas the actual Republican government kind do not do so well. All right, so propaganda. So take a look at this picture, and this is actually propaganda that existed in the northern part of China, or the part of China called Manchuria. And so what's going on in this picture? Who point of view is this? And why is it bias? What is this bias demonstrating? What do you get from this? Okay, so a couple things I have to explain. Okay, obviously this is Chinese. Well, actually, might not be obvious to some people, but this is actually Chinese. Okay, so it's written in Chinese, and this flag is actually a flag of the northern part of China called Manchuria. So this is the Manchurian flag. Okay, and of course, without a doubt, most of you should recognize this flag, and that is the Japanese flag. Okay, so think about the questions we're asking. What point of view is it? What kind of bias are we demonstrating? What kind of visual evidence do you have to support your conclusion? Okay, and also think about what you expect the people represented in this picture to behave towards each other. How do you think the people in this picture are supposed to act? Okay. All right, so let's kind of look at this and just kind of answer, what do you think the poster is depicting? Okay, A or B? I don't think you need to stop the video, but I will wait. Go ahead and select, and then move on. Okay, so this is one is actually something that you do need to answer, and we'll have a little bit of time to do that. What is happening in the pictures on slide 15? Children with varied flags on a red background. Okay, so think about that picture that we just looked at. What visual evidence do you have to support your conclusion? So we're going to be answering the questions that are on that slide. So go ahead and pause for now, okay, and go ahead and write your answers. All right, so how would you expect the people represented in this picture? Again, slide 15, same pictures of kids with red background behaving towards each other. And so this is again a very quick response. And so it's interesting, right? This is actually what the Japanese assumed. So go ahead and answer that question, okay? And I don't think you need a pause, but I'll give you like 5, 4, 3, 2, and let's go to the next slide, talking about our second video. All right, so we're going to be talking about the rape of Nanjing, and you can stop here. This is where we're going to be end, and I'm going to start video number 2 to kind of continue this video. Thank you for your time, guys, and we will see you in the next video.